For our next session, we get to hear from two colleagues and friends, Britta Traub and Robert Carswell, and I'm introducing them to start our session. Why are rights and rights management such a big deal? I've often thought in getting ready for the day today that this is probably our most understated title of the day, and Britta and Robert have put together a nice presentation for us. Robert is the digital asset and rights manager at Fine Arts Museums in San Francisco, and Britta Traub has the job now of being the rights manager at Fine Arts Museum. So welcome, glad you're here, and over to you.
Thank you, David. And hello, everyone. And good morning from California. My name is, again, Britta Traub, and I am the rights manager at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. For those of you who are not familiar with what the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco is, we are actually two museums, the De Young, which is located in Golden Gate Park, and the Legion of Honor, which is in Lincoln Park, both in West San Francisco. Our collection consists of over 166,000 objects and counting, with 127,000 of them in the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts alone. This includes our prints, drawings, photos, and works on paper. We are a publicly funded institution by the City of San Francisco and partially privately funded. We are also an acquiring institution, and not only are we overseeing acquisitions with our large and growing collection, but we also host a large number of rotating exhibitions, many of which are traveling with other institutions that we partner with. Some background on rights and rights management that I have done. Prior to coming to the Fine Arts Museums in June of 2022, I worked at the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, California, located just outside of Los Angeles. In contrast to FAMSF, the Norton Simon is a world-renowned, beautiful, privately funded and privately owned and non-acquiring institution. It's one of the most well-regarded private collections in the world. And while I was there as their rights and reproductions coordinator and assistant to the chief curator, I had the privilege of working on a much smaller scale. I was able to work directly with their curators, with their wonderful conservator, registrar, collections manager, and external affairs staff. And while I was there for 5 years, I was able to really understand the role of rights and how it actually interplays with their roles and what their work that they're doing. So my role at FAMSF when I was hired, the rights manager, my primary role here is to assess legal risk for the institution and also prevent legal conflicts. But also it goes beyond that. I also am here to establish and maintain positive, long-standing relationships with rights holders and their representatives. And we also would like to build respect and seek consent from these rights holders. Who do I work with? Basically everyone, like the Norton Simon, but here there are way many people that I am working with across two museums. So some tasks that I do is I consult with our education department on when to determine when fair use, a US law, is applicable and is very important for navigating works that are under copyright. I navigate the complexities of digitally produced content for both our website and content posted on third-party platforms. I work with our curators to ensure we have the most recent attributions and provenance details available for not only them, but also other scholars with their external requests and other complex matters related to the collections that our curators oversee. I work with our marketing team for their campaigns, as well as our development and membership teams to ensure that they have their assets cleared for usage for any events that are being hosted at the museums. I also share information between our publications and museum store team who also work with intellectual property needs in their own capacity. And then also I work very closely with our registration and exhibitions team to ensure that I review our rights and reproductions terms with our lender agreements. So rights in the permanent collections alone is very complex. And since coming on board, I've been here helping to define and outline our institutional standards to detect which objects can be considered in the public domain. I've pulled an example here of a print by the artist Wassily Kandinsky. It's the apple tree. And this information that we have on file for this helped us determine that it was in the public domain, just because under US law, the copyright, the basic framework of copyright was determined under the Copyright Act of 1976. For those of you unfamiliar, this established that any work created after 1978 was automatically under the copyright of the creator and didn't need to become registered with the Copyright Office. And then as of 1998, copyright covers the duration of the creator's life plus 70 years after their death. Works for hire extend to 95 years after the first date of publication or 120 years from creation, whichever is first. However, with works created by artists who died before 1978, like this Kandinsky, this is where it gets complicated. Copyright is determined by the first date of publication, and which is why having accurate provenance records available is important to determine this copyright status. So this work being created in 1911, but we for sure know it was first published in 1914 and the artist died in 1944, this work is for sure considered in the public domain. There are other complex instances that I must consider with dealing with rights management here. This includes working with third-party photographers for our events, marketing, and whatnot, and making sure those contracts are covering our needs. I also oversee and ensure that we are distributing model release forms at our events. So if we are photographing people, we need to make sure that we have their consent to show their faces for any sort of event that we want to promote or display on our platforms. Again, I also work on exhibition loan terms. I oversee music performance contracts as well as any music needs that we need for recordings that we do of these music performances and making sure everything is cleared there. I've also included a unique case study here, which includes a 18th century chair that's on view at the Salon Doré at the Legion of Honor. And on the left is the chair before treatment, before it was sent over to the late and esteemed Xavier Bonnet, who is a noted French upholsterer and decorative arts historian. Our curators worked with Xavier to imagine a new fabric for this decorative chair, a chair that's not to be sat on. And some rights considerations here are to see, was this fabric created entirely original? Is this fabric something that is based off of an existing fabric pattern? When we are consulting with Xavier, do we hold the rights for this pattern? So these are all conversations that I have to have with the team here, which consists of me, Robert, and one other person, Sue Grinnells. And that's what kind of makes this really exciting. Not only is copyright a concern, but there are other things that we also have to consult, which includes traditional cultural expression and traditional knowledge. This is where we have, or where the curators step in and forge relationships with traditional and indigenous groups and their representatives. So this consists of a variety of works in our collection that might be burial objects or if we host an event in which an Indigenous group is going to do a performance, we need to consult with them to ask, is this okay if we record it? Or can we, not just out of concerns for the copyright of the dance, but also more of out of a perspective of respect and consent. And also I bring up current events. This is important as we also align some moral values in which we seek consent from living artists and their active estates to ensure that we also are representing their work and align with their values with the message that we are portraying on behalf of our institution as well. When in doubt, always get everyone's needs explicitly in writing. So when I work with third-party photographers, some things to consider is I always explicitly ask, are we able to use these in perpetuity? Are we able to use your assets for archival purposes? Are we able to distribute these to third parties without additional permissions from you? And who holds the copyright of this material? And how do you want the assets credited, or if they even need to be credited at all? Also, it can't be understated, contracts will always take precedent over the law. So this is exactly why you also need to make sure all of your information is documented accurately. If a verbal agreement was made, immediately follow up your call with an email to recount exactly what was said and ensure that your party that you worked with confirms these details. And exactly why we need to make sure all of this is arranged properly. So to backtrack a little, the history of rights at FAMSF is that it's actually quite new. It was established around 2017 under Robert Carswell, who is the first rights and digital assets manager at the Fine Arts Museums, and I am only the second rights manager. In 2019, FAMSF committed to working under a new dam system, but obviously COVID-19 hit in 2020 and impacted not only the rollout of this system to have access for all of our staff, but also COVID-19, as I'm sure all of you imagine, had you realizing rights and the way that we use stuff in our collections was starting to change rather dynamically, and having all of this stuff organized is more important than ever. So I'd really like to hand it off to Robert so that he can talk about what we're doing to ensure it's all clean over here.
Thank you, Britta. Thanks so much. So let's see, just a brief introduction. I've been working in the museum in some way since about 2008. 2016, I earned my MLS from San Jose State. And then 2017, the digital asset and rights management position opened up. And I was able to get that position, as Britta said, the first person in it. When I tell folks digital asset and rights, they often think, wow, but it was a wonderful way to start because it really helped hammer into me the importance of rights. And I'm so glad that I kind of had that approach to start with. I think the museums definitely have kind of grown to a place where they do need to split those off. But it was definitely a wonderful place to start. I am coming from Georgia, and I actually, my asset position ended with the museum last week because I now live in Georgia, and it would be better for them to have someone on site for that position. But I do continue to kind of work for them in a contract basis, doing little things that come up. And then in 2022, I earned my advanced certificate in digital asset management from Rutgers. And that has been extremely helpful, especially with the implementation process of this new dams. The next slide, Britta. So this slide, one I wanted to share because it's the beautiful view that Britta and I had from, that Britta has and that I had from our position in the museum. And it's one of the best places to look out over the museum. But what I'm sharing today is definitely a work under process. It's in progress. This is a good snapshot of where we are now. We've just started to kind of get things rolled out, and a lot of these, this metadata setup, we just started to really test in real world in the past couple of months. And I can definitely say that cross traffic does not stop when you're implementing a dam, when you're working on your metadata, your other duties are going to continue and you're just going to have to work it in. And that's museum life, as we all kind of are aware of. There's always more work and less staff, but we just keep on keeping on. And then share the road. I want to put a little different angle on this. I'm actually looking at sharing our journey, you know, where we are in the process and where we're kind of looking to go. And for some of you, this may be kind of, you know, super simple and you've been there, but I hope some of the things that we mentioned today confirm what you already know. And for a lot of you folks, I'm sure some of this will be kind of new and really helpful. So either way, we're really hoping that you'll get something from this that will be useful for you. But as I said, this is kind of a snapshot of where we are. And we're fortunate in that we wanted to focus on rights metadata first, you know, instead of maybe comparing descriptive metadata. And one of the reasons that we're allowed to do that is because our collection management system, our CMS, and our dams are integrated. So when we link media to an object record, if you find that object, then you find all the media that's linked to that object. We can also link assets to exhibition records. So if you look at a particular exhibition, that will help you find all that, the media that's attached to that exhibition. And then we've also spent some time setting up naming conventions. And for most of our users, they're searching for sets of images and usually the same type of images. So once they kind of learn that new naming convention, they'll be able to search for their and find their images relatively simple without having to have too much descriptive metadata. Next slide. So the question, this is just kind of a sampling of rights agreements and rights permissions. How do we combine all this information? How do we get all of this rights information, this metadata, and make it readily available to staff? Permissions can be confusing and rights information can definitely be hard to navigate. And there's different types of permission information. There's copyright, there's the lender restrictions, there's cultural restrictions possibly, and then there's the media itself with its permissions and restrictions. So how do we include and present rights information that will help our users now and provide archive documentation for past uses? Next slide. For us, I think the big thing was realizing we have object rights information in one bucket, and we have media permissions and information in another bucket. Our object rights information and permissions focus on basically what media can we make from that object? We have an object in the collection or an object on loan. It's on display. Can we videotape it? Can we photograph it? Then how can those resulting assets be used or shared? And what's the required copyright notice? Then for our media, we're much more focused on who created and supplied that media. And then what objects or people are in that media that may also require separate permissions. And then any permissions or restrictions that we have on the media itself. So for us, we came to the decision that our CMS would be the source of truth for our object information, even object rights information. And then our dams would be our source of truth for the media asset information. Next slide. So looking at object rights metadata and kind of digging into that, where we're using the CMS. First, I want to thank Getty for their article, Rights Metadata Made Simple by Maureen Whalen, and also the Copyright MD user guidelines from the California Digital Library. We definitely pulled from those articles, and they were definitely a really good guide for us on how to kind of do this object information. Another advantage for us is because this object information, rights information is stored in the CMS, we've got other museum departments that are responsible for some of that information. So with an object, the creator, the life dates, the work title, the creation date, all of that sort of stuff is being entered by our curatorial staff for the object. So that information that we then need to determine copyright on that object, that information is already there and provided by the curators. For culturally sensitive objects that shouldn't be displayed or reproduced, or our curatorial staff, they're also marking those objects for us. So right out of the bat, we've got some information being being given to us by other departments that help us in our rights determination. And then for lent objects that could have lender restrictions, we've got our registrars who are entering that information in the CMS. So it basically leaves for media services to deal with the direct copyright information. And that's what we enter into the CMS. And what we're looking at is the publication date, as Britta mentioned earlier, for a lot of museum objects, and especially in our collection, a lot of them are before 1978, they were created before 1978. So we have to look at when they would be considered published to determine the copyright. So we wanted to make sure that we had sort of some fields set up to document when something was published, so that we could really base our copyright date or public domain date off of that publication date. We also wanted to make sure that we had the copyright status, whether it was under copyright, public domain, et cetera, marked down, the copyright notice, copyright in the artist date, and then the copyright expiration date and rationale. And both for the kind of publication date and especially the expiration date of copyright, we really took advantage of Cornell University Library's webpage, where they've got copyright services, copyright term in the public domain. And we used their kind of definitions and guidance on when copyright terms to kind of set up when, our fields for determining when an object would move out of copyright. We also want to make sure that we've got any copyright holders in that record. And then we also wanted to make some room for researcher notes, because all of this is a work in progress. It's being done by different people at different times. Britta may work on determining copyright for an object now, get some of that research done, and then have to pick up 6 months later down the line to continue it. So to be able to have her notes right there in the CMS is a huge advantage. It allows her to kind of keep working, or whoever is kind of working on that. Next slide. Our media rights are handled in the DAMs, and they're fairly simple because most of our media, fortunately, is digital media. So we're looking at the 90s or the 2000s, as the earliest possible creation dates generally. So we're just looking at copyright status, the copyright and credit line, and then media stakeholders. And that's not just, we want to make sure that for the media stakeholders, we're marking down who supplied it and the photographer and that sort of information for the asset. But we also want to make sure that we're marking any potential rights stakeholders that could be displayed in that image, whether they're works of art in that image, or whether there's people. We also want to make sure that we had fields for that. And then the next slide. It may not be obvious with this quick presentation, but with the objects and the media, we really tried to keep it simple and just tried to basically mark the copyright status and the stakeholders. So we realized that we needed a license record where we could actually keep up with the permissions that we got from artists for objects and from media suppliers for the media. The rights info is basically static for the most part, that we include in our object and our media, where our permissions info is usually temporary and reoccurring. We could get a permission for something for the catalog for an exhibition, and then for promotions for the exhibition, and then for a marketing campaign. To have all of that within the object or the media record was just too confusing, and it made it too hard for us and our users to navigate. So we decided by having a separate license record, we can create a separate license record for each permission, and then link that to the appropriate object or media. And then by doing that, it allows us to search and report on that to add more thorough information than we could have just by having it in the media or the object record information. So for us, that was definitely a route that we wanted to head into, because we can also mark those records whether they're active or not, because we could have media or objects that could have multiple licenses going back years and including the present. And we just wanted to, by approaching it as a license record, we felt that we would have much more kind of control on what our users would come across and see, and make it much easier for them to understand exactly what they could do. Next slide. From this process, what have we gained so far? And again, we're still in the middle of it, but what have we gained? One, the importance of scalability. with COVID and with change, with perhaps a recession this year, we really need to make sure that this functions, even if only minimal metadata can be entered. So if we have a good solid naming convention, it allows staff to search for specific sets of assets. And also it allows the staff that's closest to the creation of the asset to add valuable metadata right there in the file name. We've also set it up where we can add PDFs of the license or even email permissions and link it directly to our license record. And then that clarifies what the permissions and restrictions are given in the grantor's own words. So it clears up any ambiguity that we may have. We wanted to ensure that we're preparing for future improvements without blocking our needs in the future. So this is really important for us to kind of have these PDFs attached. The goal is we'll still fill out the metadata that goes along with it, but even if we can't, for whatever reason, anyone that finds that record can still find the license and know what they can do with it or not. And then another important thing is you need time to test and play. As we're finding out now, you really don't know what you've got until you kind of get in the meat and potatoes and start playing and working with these things. And I would definitely recommend doing that before you kind of share it with staff at large. Next slide. And I won't go through all of these, but this is just to make a point of there's still plenty left to do. Even where we're at with our rights metadata, we still definitely have things that we want to do with the dams and how we want to move the dams forward. And then final slide. And just wanted to take a chance to thank folks, our media team, Sue Reynolds especially, for the help that she's been on this project and leading this project. Our collection information team, who really has worked behind the scenes and helped us with both the CMS and dam setup. Our communications team and graphic design team for helping us out with the slides. Henry Stewart for having us and giving us a chance to kind of give this talk. David Lipsey, of course, thank you for hosting. And most of all, thank you folks for coming in and listening to our presentation. We really appreciate it. David?
Robert, thanks so much. I appreciate the acknowledgement. And I want to call out just with a quick highlight, and we've got time for just a couple questions. The test and play idea. Sometimes the apparent logic of a request, well, Britta, you can get this all squared in that, right? It just then, and okay, that paragraph made a lot of sense. But sometimes we forget that with a lot of things in digital enablement, we do need a laboratory moment. We need the time to step back, try it, see did it make sense to the person for whom it was supposed to make sense to. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. All right, so I'm going to ask a couple flashcard style questions. We do want to thank many people contributed resource ideas in the Q&A and in the chat to where to tune to, because there were questions about this, Britta. Where did she learn all this stuff? That were kind of fun. It made me think, okay, we're going to follow up on that. Britta, I have an assumptive answer, but I'm going to test and play it here. Do you link model rights to the digital assets where they're used?
I'm sorry, model rights?
Model,
yes.
Model releases, yeah.
So those are linked to our license record. So we do create essentially an event.
Okay. And Robert, a question for you. How as this unfolded with what the two of you have been working on, how is this socialized around the institution? That there is a more centralized way to approach this complicated, critical, institutionally risk mitigating work that you all do. How do people hear about it?
Yeah, this is still a process that's kind of being unrolled because we haven't actually got to the point where the dams has been introduced to our staff yet or turned over to our staff. But what we're looking at now is we're looking at bringing in a few test users from particular departments that we know have heavy use for asset request. So our first is we're going to kind of start with a small group of folks to get in there and test the system and see how the system works and if it functions the way that we wanted it to function, that it's meeting their needs. And as we iron that out, then the plan is then to kind of introduce it to the rest of staff and roll it out to the remainder of the museum. But our goal too is hopefully by getting those sort of power users in there. And Britta and I are already aware of the folks that make the most requests and need the most assets.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So it's bringing those folks to the table and
Mhm.
kind of showing them, hey, this is what we're doing, and this is what we're doing to make it easier for you. No longer will you have to come to us and ask us to look for a certain kind of object in the collection. This will enable you to be able to do it.
Great. I know you will both miss being the search bar. So,
Yes.
so- All right. Well, on that note, thank you both for the time devoted to putting this presentation together, for the hard work that you're doing, a very lucid explanation of it. We could certainly go on till well into the afternoon Pacific time. Maybe someday we'll have the opportunity to do that. Thanks for the presentation. Look forward to seeing you both soon and talking again soon.
Thank you so much,
Thank
David.
you.
You bet. For our next session, I'll be introducing in just a few minutes quickfire presentations with the Milwaukee Museum of Art and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. See you shortly over there.